It's been really cloudy for the last couple of months, but as luck would have it, a couple of weeks ago there was a small period of clear sky one evening, and as luck would have it, the moon was full on that particular night, which meant that taking deep sky pictures of galaxies and nebulae and stuff wouldn't really have been ideal. So I decided to make the best of it and try and take a photograph of the moon. So rather than use a telescope and a dedicated planetary camera, I decided I'd try and replicate the process that would be used by a beginner trying to take their first photograph of the moon. So yeah, welcome back to my channel. My name's John and I make videos on camping, walking and astronomy. If you like what you see in this video, then please check my channel out, as you may find others that interest you there. But in the meantime, let's crack on with this video. So I said I was going to replicate somebody's first attempt at taking a picture of the moon. In reality, it's probably the second attempt, because most people's first attempt would be to use a mobile phone. And we've probably all been there and seen a lovely moon up out in the sky, and taken our phone out, taken a picture of it and found it's really disappointing. The image of the moon is dead small on the screen, and there's very little detail that can be extracted from it. So yeah, from this point people try and look to say, well, how can I improve on this? So a good way of improving without using any sort of specialist gear is to use a DSLR camera and lens. And in fact, any camera really will do, so long as you can convert it to fully manual control and have a telephoto lens. To get the best results, you want the biggest telephoto lens that you've got. You also need a tripod to keep the camera steady, and in an ideal world, an intervalometer, so that you don't have to touch the camera when you take your shots. My normal tripod, the one that I use for photography, is a very cheap, very light, very rickety affair, but nonetheless this is the one that I decided to use for this exercise. And my intervalometer equally is a cheap one off Amazon, probably £20 maximum, I would say. And the idea is that you use it as a remote shutter release so that you don't have to touch the camera when you take your picture. But if you haven't got an intervalometer, or your camera hasn't got the little connection port for one, then you can just use the little self-timer thingy to get 5 or 10 second delay between when you press the shutter and when the camera actually takes its shots. I mentioned earlier that you need a camera that can be set to fully manual mode, and the reason for this is that the moon is a very bright object and is set against a very dark background, and the auto settings on cameras have a real job of trying to get this sorted out. So it's much better if you can set your camera fully into manual mode. Most of the time my astrophotography images are things like galaxies and nebulae, and these objects are very, very dim and very, very far away. And in order to take pictures of these things, you need long exposure times, high ISO settings, and very small f-stop numbers to get the maximum amount of light you can into your camera. Lunar photography, on the other hand, is the kind of diametric opposite to this. The moon is so bright that you need short exposure times, pretty well the lowest ISO number that you can have with your camera, and high f-stop numbers to keep the aperture very small. And these settings are manually adjusted from the back of your camera, and you need typically a sort of good starting point will be an ISO of 1 to 200, a exposure time of maybe 1/250th or 1/400th of a second, and an f-stop of something like f10 or 11. And you need also to put your camera into manual focus mode. Some cameras can actually do autofocus, but mine doesn't seem to work very well on things like the moon. So manual focus is really the way to go, and then you've got full control. Having plugged in your initial settings, you just take a test shot and see what comes out. The live view, in fact, on the back of the camera will give you a fairly good idea of what you're going to get. It's generally better to have an underexposed image rather than an overexposed one. Once images are overexposed, the sheer brightness blows out a lot of the detail, and that can't really be recovered in your little photo editing software that you might be using on your phone or computer. But an underexposed image can quite easily be brightened, have its exposure artificially increased to bring out any detail that's hidden in there. So always go for something that's slightly underexposed rather than overexposed. Having got your settings more or less sorted out, you then need to get your focus fine-tuned. And as I said, the best way of doing this is you need to do manual focus, and then looking back on your live view on the back of your camera, you want to blow that image up as much as you can. Some cameras it's 5 times, sometimes it's 10 times. The actual image without blowing up, you take a moon with a 300mm lens, is still very small in the screen. So you want to blow it up, see as much detail as you can, and fiddle around with the focus in order to get it as tight as you possibly can. So now you take your shots either using the intervalometer, so you don't have to touch the camera, or the self timer to get maybe a 5 or 10 second gap between taking pressing the shutter and actually taking the image. From this test shot you can fine tune your settings, change the ISO value or the shutter speed in order to get the sort of brightness of image that you're actually looking for. And it's worth noting here that you actually need to take multiple images because you're shooting through a fairly wobbly atmosphere, and this means that often the image that you get won't be in particularly crisp focus. So the best way of getting around this is to take lots of images, maybe 20 of them or even more, and with a bit of luck one of those images will be shot when the atmosphere is sitting pretty steady, and you get a nice picture come out of it. Sometimes though, even with all this effort, things don't quite work out as you like. Here's the best image that I took on this particular night, and as you can see, that even though this is the best image, it's not quite as clear as I would want it to be. It's a massive improvement over what I took with the mobile phone, and I guess probably if this was my first real attempt, I'll be quite happy with it. But I know it's possible to do considerably better than this. Now the problems that I had on this particular night was, although it was clear, it was dead windy, and as I mentioned earlier, my tripod's a cheap rickety affair, and it was struggling to hold the camera steady against the wind. And on top of this, I think the wind probably messed up the atmospherics, creating a really bad atmosphere to shoot through. So this was the best I got on that particular night, and then the clouds came over, and that was the kind of end of that night's session anyway. Now, as luck would have it, the next night was clear as well, and the moon equally was sort of full. It doesn't change that much from one day to the next. Importantly though, it wasn't windy, so I went out again to replicate what I'd done the night before, but this time round I used a much heavier tripod. It's the one that I normally use with my Star Adventurer tracker mount sitting on the top of it for taking wide angle shots of the Milky Way and stuff like that. So it's a considerably beefier tripod. I'd used exactly the same settings as the night before and got a considerably better result. So the moral of the story here really is to use the most secure, beefiest tripod that you have, and to try and pick a night when it's not too windy, when the weather's playing ball. So I was quite pleased with this image, considering that I used no specialist equipment, no telescope, no planetary cameras or anything like that, no special techniques. and I think it's a huge step up from what you get off of a mobile phone. It is possible to get better than this, and every now and again I do go out and do a specific moonshot, but as I say, this involves using planetary cameras, fairly specialist processing techniques to overcome wobbly atmospheres and things like that. But as a kind of beginner's attempt at taking a photo of a moon without using any fancy gear, yeah, I think what you can get with a DSLR camera is really rather good. I'll put the image up now. I hope you like it, and have a little go yourself at doing this sort of thing. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. Cheerio.